Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of Elevenses, the topical news, controversial views, and biking tips show. I was hoping that we might have some clear advice from the government on what we were allowed and not allowed to do by today, but we're still getting conflicting information, I think, from Boris and company. But hey ho, that's politics, and I don't really want to go that way. So we'll stick with the plan, which is the interview which I recorded a few days ago with Dave Moss. Dave's out in California, so he won't be watching at the moment because I think it's bang on 3 a.m. out there. But Dave's, as I explained in the interview, I met Dave a few years ago now when I was out in New Zealand. And I can honestly say there aren't many people who know more about suspension and bike setup. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview and enjoy. And again, if you've got any questions, drop them off at the end of the session. And if I can't answer them, I'll pass them on to Dave. Right, so on with the interview. Right, so welcome everybody to the interview with Dave Moss. I first met Dave Moss out in New Zealand when I was working on the Shiny Side Up tour back in 2018. Dave was talking
out from four walls. So to date, there's been no problem being sensible with your motorcycle to get out and ride, and obviously not aggregating groups, but get to different places to sit down and just kind of enjoy the fact that you're not trapped in your own home.
Yeah, well, as you've probably heard, that we're treating it a little bit more strictly over here in the UK, and recreational riding isn't allowed at the moment. So there are an awful lot of us who are stuck indoors and starting to miss our biking fix. And the weather in the spring here in the UK has been particularly spectacular this year, and so I think there's a lot of people very frustrated. But what we can do, if we can't ride, we can at least learn about riding, can't we? So let's crack on with the interview then. The first thing I really wanted to ask you is give us a little bit of background about how it was that you got into motorcycling in the first place.
I was almost born in a sidecar because my father was relatively strong. He made it back into the house with mom. So I believe there's an attachment there. And as three kids in the sidecar and mom and dad on the bike, that's what we grew up with until we were all too big to be in the sidecar. So I've been around motorcycles my entire life. And as a kid, I think it will be fair to say in the UK, and as in most of the countries in Europe, getting a motorcycle is a rite of passage. And it gives you the freedom to go further than a bicycle would, even though a bicycle is much healthier and far better for you. So in doing that, I returned to motorcycling after I couldn't play rugby anymore, and decided to get into racing at the ungodly age of, what was I, 35? Apparently I missed the boat and did it backwards. You're supposed to do it when you're young. So in doing that, or as with all things in life, wisdom is only achieved through experience. So I found the oldest guys I could find, fed them scotch and beer for a year, and just sat there with a pad and pen and listened. And the foundation of knowledge I've acquired since then has really been some textbook stuff, because classroom always has a good part in your life, but then taking that and putting it into the real world application of actually riding a bike on the track and then racing, to see what holds true for me versus what holds true in a book. And so leveraging that information has helped me help tens of thousands of riders all over the world, thankfully with the level of technology we have like today. So it's been interesting to come back to motorcycling in a time where, when we started riding, there really wasn't a lot to do with a motorcycle. We just rode them. And now you have electronics, you have complex ECUs, you have all kinds of submenus, and you have absurdly powerful motorcycles that will do incredible things because tire technology is at pace with engine performance. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, cool. So, building on your experience, and what is it that you found you have been able to deliver to riders that they kind of couldn't work out for themselves?
I think the first thing there is one of the questions I ask people, and you've heard me ask it in the past in New Zealand, would you ever rent a car and for the period of time of the rental, when you open that car door, never move the seat and the steering wheel? And people look at me like I've lost my mind. But the bottom line is, when we get a motorcycle, what are the first things that we do to it? It is not to get it ergonomically correct for us. It is not to make it comfortable. And it is not to set the suspension up correctly for our body weight and type of use. It is to ride it. And that's a cultural heritage over the last 70, 80 years, because there originally was never anything to adjust. So what I give people, and I hope that I inspire them with, is to acquire more knowledge. And through that knowledge, gain the confidence to pick up some tools or a tire pressure gauge and start their personal journey of knowledge acquisition through testing. Because testing with your own bike will yield you the information you need to understand why you would always put the car rental seat in the correct position. And if you had steering wheels and other stuff, you would do all of that by default. So it's bringing people on track, because in the dirt world, that holds true. In bicycling, if you buy an expensive bicycle, it's 90 minutes of biomechanical hell until such time as you are fitted to that bicycle perfectly. But for some reason, road motorcycles got left out. So helping them and inspiring them to help themselves, but more importantly for me, is for them to pay it forward and help other people that really aren't there yet.
Okay, cool. I mean, you've partly answered my next question, but a little comment on what you just said there about the bicycles is that my brother was a fairly keen cyclist. He still is, actually, but he was, moving into the competition cycling. And as soon as he started to take it seriously, the first thing he did was he went out and had a hand-built bike built to fit him, because he's a long-bodied, short-legged ape kind of shape, and so the bikes off the shelf, even very expensive ones, simply didn't fit him. So basically what we're saying here is that sometimes the posture issues that we have on motorcycles, that's really what I want to focus on today at least, is that the motorcycles are generally pretty much designed as one size fits all. Would you say that sometimes, though, that the challenge is to get the rider to understand how best to use their own body on the motorcycle?
Yeah, I think the first perspective there is just simple stuff like, what's your shoe size? Between the peg and the shifter, are you making your foot fit? How many times do you shift? In doing that and making that happen, what are the kick-on effects of that create different levels of muscular stress in your body, or joint tension, or how are you physically moving every time you shift, because the distance between the peg and the shifter isn't correct. So you're affecting the way the bike moves, and now you're constantly moving around the motorcycle, which affects its balance and performance. Same is true of controls. How often do you use the clutch and the brakes? I have very short fingers and a very long palm. So sometimes stock levers won't work for me at all. And other times people have short palm and long fingers and go by color coordinated shorty levers, because it looks so complementary to the overall picture of their motorcycle. But then they end up shifting with knuckles and fingers closed, with no finesse and no feel in their fingertips at all. And over that, one of the things we all fight as riders will be numb fingers or wrists, forearm pain, we get shoulder pain, we get neck pain, and all of that is an ergonomic consequence of not being fitted to the motorcycle correctly. So the cycle is very simple. You buy a bike, you ride the hell out of it because it's brand new, you love it. It starts to hurt, you ride it less. It hurts more, you sell it, and you buy another motorcycle and you repeat the cycle. And many of your viewers, I'm sure, will sit for a moment and reflect on this and go, huh. I remember doing it myself as a kid, because now it was time for something new, because this bike, I didn't want to ride it anymore. And the whole reason for that was because I didn't fit myself to it, or the suspension, or any of the other parts. And so your posture becomes a consequence of what the motorcycle puts you in. And as we've all learned from statistics, loss of control in the corner is one of the greatest causes of fatalities and crashes. And so is fatigue. So getting yourself fit to the bike and getting the suspension set correctly, maybe that takes away 80% of the pain and misery that you go through when you ride your bike over a certain period of time.
Okay, what would you say to the argument that a lot of these problems are simply down to the style of bike that people choose? You know, you have a lot of people who ride a cruiser or a tourer, and they'll say something like, you know, you wouldn't catch me on one of those sports bikes because they're so uncomfortable to ride. But does a sports bike really have to be uncomfortable? And is something like a tourer or a cruiser automatically more comfortable?
So one of the things that people don't measure is basically the steering stem nut on the upper triple clamp to their belly button. Now, depending on your spine length, that could be a Spanish Inquisition torture rack, because the distance is so far that no matter if it's a touring bike, a standard or naked motorcycle, or a sport bike, it is quite simply too far. And you are carrying the entire weight of your torso on your wrists. So to that extent, and I think in a lot of times, people don't realize that reach to the handlebar is by far one of the most critical factors on comfort for a motorcycle. Sport bikes, by default, with leaning forward, if you don't put the handlebars in a different position and you don't angle the levers correctly, yeah, it's substantially painful because there's much more weight bearing. Your triangle's generally much tighter, whereas with a standard motorcycle, it's generally more upright with your spine and therefore less weight on your wrists. But the same is true of a standard bar or a touring bar. Some of those are fixed and bolted down and you can't do anything about it. So let's say a Kawasaki Concourse. They're bolted in and there's nothing you can do. A Ninja 300 handlebars are bolted. There's nothing you can do. But when you have a handlebar, you can roll it forwards and backwards and get that gap from your belly button to the bar set where you want. Or you can get risers. Same with a sport bike. Healy bars is a good example of bringing the handlebars up a few inches. There's lots of ways to do this. And we are so blessed with an aftermarket burgeoning with stuff that the problem there is choice. If there were 3 pairs of jeans to buy, it would be easy to buy jeans. But we have, it was in a TED talk, I think he said there were 130 pairs, unique pairs of jeans you could buy. So one of the parts is it's too daunting to go in there and find what you need. So for me, I don't mind what you ride. There is a consequence to what you ride, obviously, but that consequence can be mitigated versus buying a slip-on exhaust because you want it to sound a particular way. So to that extent, sport bikes will create more pain simply because of the load on your wrist. But if you fix that appropriately, as we've shown in many videos on ergonomics that are both on YouTube and the website, you can make that equally as comfortable, I think, over the same period of time. But obviously you're not going to ride a sport bike for 10 hours a day where you would ride a standard or a touring bike. Okay, so when you actually look though at individual riders, where do you find common issues? You've already mentioned wrists and fingers. Well, how would you what other problems would you spot on a regular basis? A lot of times, because when we ride, the handlebar goes diagonally across our palm and doesn't come here. The shoulders carry the brunt of shoulders and elbows, but more shoulders carry the brunt of braking, for example. And if something is bumpy and you're going down a very poor grade road, then a lot of times your arms are more suspension than your feet are because your bum's off the seat quite a lot. So a lot of the time there's a ton of stress in the shoulders up here and up in the deltoids and the back of the neck, because they become not so much pressure points, but they become literally suspension while you're trying to keep yourself centered on the motorcycle. The other part that can often suffer is the joint of the hip and the spine, because if that is getting compressed through bumps and you're getting that impact into the hip and spine, there can be a lot of problems there. And the other one that generally we come across where people slowly get off a motorcycle is their knee angle is far too acute, because they've not opened it up to where they can actually relax their thigh and cuff. So those are the key ones that I tend to find people, once set up correctly, find instant relief with.
Right. Okay. So again, how would these poor posture issues affect the motorcycle itself? You've alluded to having too much weight on the wrists. You've pointed out that you can be, again, posture can bounce you out of the seat. What's the implication for that in terms of how the bike handles underneath the rider?
So if we are in an ideal world, then the motorcyclist is sat in a position that the motorcycle was designed for, because your physical weight is all part of that centered mass. So if your posture is off, then the weight distribution or the balance of the motorcycle might be changed dramatically. And because of that, then you're influencing one section of the bike more than the other. So if you are very long spined and long arm, then your weight is going to go far more proportionately to the back of the bike. So for example, if you're accelerating out of a corner, because more weight is on the rear of the bike, the front may have less grip, simply because the stress on the springs are increased in the rear of the bike, simply because of the way you're positioned and sat, based on your physical self, not just your physical weight. So with a sport bike with somebody with the same long spine, long arms, then there's a lot more weight on the handlebars. And therefore the front end works harder going into the corner. And because of that, the rear end is working less. So the posture will certainly influence where the weight transfer goes to. And as a concept, a lot of people don't understand what weight transfer is about. But simply having that going into braking and accelerating is one thing. And then when we're cornering, if you have a long posture, then you have a big pendulum that you are throwing outside the motorcycle. So that's a lot more weight and influence on how the bike's going to turn. So based on how you're anatomically shaped, it can have profound effects on the way the bike handles.
Okay, so if you are setting up a race bike, presumably you're going to have a budget to put into that bike, and you can make some fairly serious changes. I mean, I know a little bit about how you set a bike up for racing, having worked occasionally with some guys who used to run an endurance team. But the ordinary road rider, what can they do? What fixes have they got? Imagine that you're talking to a newish rider, someone who basically has the bike manual in front of them and the bike toolkit and not a lot else. What can they do? Where should they start, and what can they achieve with those limited tools?
With just the tool kit, I think we have to go back to the 70s for a decent toolkit. These days, you might get a screwdriver and an Allen that's clamped under the seat, and that's where you're at. But with simple tools and a little bit of time, and basically time is your expense. Some of it you don't need tools. If your brake and clutch lever is adjustable, you can set your reach so that the lever is on the end of your fingertip so it comes over, and set correctly so here it can pull. If your fingertips here, it lifts. So set the distance from the grip to the lever correctly if you can. That's the first part. Then angle-wise, we don't want this. Worse, if you're here with the throttle and you have to accelerate into a braking situation, that's all bad. So if you can hold the grip and move your fingers forward that way, then simply angling the brake and the clutch lever is a 5mm Allen or an 8mm or a 10mm bolt. You can loosen it and get the angle set correctly for you. Now, with age comes stories, and with stories comes asymmetry. So the clutch and the brake lever don't have to be at the right angle. Sometimes the handlebars are movable. If it's a race bike or just your own motorcycle, based on that reach we talk about and your triangle here between spine and arms, handlebars will move. And the goal is that this is wrong because you're going to steer with your thumb, because you're reaching for the lever and you're actually turning or inputting to the handlebars every time you brake or shift. So some handlebars are movable stock. So if you loosen a bolt, there's an adjustment forwards and backwards, which we call sweep. So if you can get the handlebar in the middle of your palm as it was designed to be, then you're in really good shape, because now the stress has gone off the edge of your hand on the heel, and all the pressure's gone off your thumb. So those are the first and most easiest ones to do. Getting the angle between your foot and the shifter is also very important. So what we biomechanically can't do with our foot is pull up far. It just doesn't happen. So what you want to do is make sure that your ankle is loose based on the flexibility you have. And then when you shift up, you're not going past 90 degrees. So that may require your ankle to extend. Now, if you are older with stories, because you did wonderful things when you were young, maybe that angle has to change because you've got a fused ankle or you have arthritis or something else. So those adjustments need to be made for you and can be changed with time. And then the same would be true of the brake lever. You don't want to lift your foot up to go get the brake lever. And one of the things a lot of people don't understand is between manufacturers for the shifter and the brake, who decided that gap is correct for everyone? So one of the first things I will buy is actually a shifter that's adjustable. So I can move the toe piece forward or backwards, depending on the gap, to actually have my foot relax, get the right angle, no matter what the bike is that I ride, whether it's dirt, road, or race, because then shifting becomes effortless. And then the last piece of the puzzle is where the foot peg is for we talked about that acute angle with your knee. Some bikes give you 3 positions to move it around on, and some do not. So the part there is, are you willing to look at your motorcycle to see what you have so that you can make yourself comfortable? And if you don't have that, and you do have a limited budget, what can you afford? So
yeah, okay. So what you're saying basically is that there are some very simple, very straightforward setup issues here that virtually anyone can do with access to just some very standard tools. So even if you haven't got a basic toolkit on the bike, you can pop out and buy something inexpensive which will unbolt and bolt up the bits that you're talking about moving here.
Yeah.
What could you do if you're a little bit more competent as a sort of a home mechanic, a sort of person who's already happy doing oil filter changes, taking calipers apart, cleaning them up, bolting new pads on, changing chains? Those require slightly more technical skills. So what can a rider like that do with their motorcycle?
So at that point, if you're comfortable with tools, we would want to go to the next level, which is to actually take a look at the settings you've got in your forks and shock. What is adjustable? What is not adjustable? Just because it's not adjustable doesn't mean you're stuck. It's a very fatalistic point of view. So even if you have non-adjustable forks, you can do different oil, you can do different springs and spacers, you can move the forks up and down and change your geometry. You can change the rear shock spring. You could get into all of that for a little bit of more time, a little more understanding in terms of moving the balance point of the motorcycle backwards and forwards. But for me, with a person like that, the most important thing for them to consider and realize and then correct is that motorcycle tires have no universal mold. A 180/55 between a Pirelli Corsa 3 and a Pirelli SP or an old Dragon, for example. They're all different circumferences. And one of the things that we all miss out on, because it is not an area of study at all for your average rider, is that the handling of the bike can be destroyed because you put some new tires on it. Or conversely, it can be miraculously wonderful, whereas before it was awful. So somebody who's competent can change their fork oil, for example, and get the right viscosity in there, and really make an enormous difference to how the bike handles by putting the right components or oils into the suspension and then setting it correctly, just like they would pull a caliper apart and clean the pistons and put new O-rings in, and all of a sudden it's a miraculously better braking motorcycle. So that level of maintenance, that level up, we have videos on what we call dump and run, which is get the old oil out, get the fresh oil in. Here's how you measure the volume or level. Carry on. So at that point, we're trying to get people to feel encouraged that they don't have to go out for a full mechanics course and spend thousands of pounds on specialized equipment, when a socket set, some screwdrivers, Allens, and a couple of spanners will get the job done, no problem at all.
It's interesting the point you made there about the ease of changing the fork oil, because I think it's something that so few people ever consider doing. But funnily enough, I used to have an old 404 Honda. You probably remember those.
Yep.
At the time, the Japanese approach to suspension was basically to make everything very bouncy, and the 404 was the polar opposite. It was the suspension was rigid at both ends, and virtually the first thing I did when I rode that bike was followed a magazine article which said put some lighter weight fork oil in, and all of a sudden the forks moved and it was transformed. It no longer skipped over bumps. It no longer locked the front wheel up on braking, which had caused me a crash. All of a sudden, I could stop, and it went over bumps. It was a much better bike to ride for what was it? Probably an hour's investment in time, and a few pounds worth of investment in some oil. It was one of the cheapest and most sort of buck per bang fixes I've ever done, I have to say. Right, okay, now I think you've given riders a pretty good idea of what they can achieve in terms of sorting their own posture out on the motorcycle. I'll just ask one supplementary question. What are the giveaway signs for a rider that there's something wrong? We've mentioned the sort of the pains in shoulders and pains in wrists are always a good sign, but is there anything that the bike can feed back to you that should make you think, hang on, there's something not quite right here?
Couple things. One is very simple, which is when you apply the brakes, the bike dives. And that makes you release the brakes and re-brake. So in terms of handling, that's probably top of the list, that most riders will understand and immediately go, oh, yeah, I get that. I understand what that means. You experienced with the 404 the opposite of it not diving at all and no suspension travel. So the other piece of the puzzle there is that when riding, you feel like you are just on a plank.
Yeah.
So that's the second part. Now, there's a difficulty there in saying that, because one of the things that people don't do is assess the amount of travel they use in their forks in the shock, because they're not trained to use their eyes in that regard. So a cable tie on the right fork leg, irrespective of telescopic or upside down forks, will give you a quantifiable amount of travel. Similarly, looking at the rear shock, you can see the shock shaft inside of it. And if you spray it with some WD-40 and let it dry, you will get a dirt ring. So soft and hard suspension feel the same. So you have to go out and get some data to actually do that. The other part is what most people will commonly feel: it wobbles in the corner. And then when they go to accelerate, they're looking through the corner and the bike is not complying with your eyes. So you either have to get out of the throttle, you have to put the throttle on later, or you have to carry the brakes past the point where your eyes show the corner opens before you can reach the throttle. So those are the classic telltale signs. And what that does with your coordination is make you behave in a certain way. So actions are not smooth with your body, they are ratcheting. They come as a consequence, they don't come as riding normally. So then usually when a bike isn't handling well, you're dealing with the consequences of that, and your ability to relax on the motorcycle is taken away. So in terms of your body, you're constantly in a state of muscle tension. So that will manifest itself in your quadriceps, it will manifest itself in your calves. For those that grip tightly with their knees, their stomach muscles will magically appear after 6 months because you're constantly trying to climb onto the tank. And overall, when you get off the bike, there's this sense of entire body fatigue because the bike isn't set up correctly for you in numerous ways. And that's where this ride it hurts more, ride less, sell by another one comes along, because we've not been taught or given the permission, realistically, because you have to take it to the shop to get in there and fix it for ourselves.
Okay, excellent. So basically, riding a bike is work, but we can make it harder for ourselves than it needs to be, is what you're saying there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we can wind up now. We've covered the sort of posture issues I wanted to talk about today, and given our listeners hopefully a good idea about where to go with their own bike and what they can think about improving. So just round off, I gather you've got quite an impressive collection of videos on YouTube. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, there's 20 years of work on YouTube, all aimed at people like ourselves in empowering you to pick up some tools, hit the pause button, and go ahead and get something started in terms of task completion. Whether that's testing tire pressures or whether that's getting your ergonomics set or any other task along the way. So you'll also find lots of playlists there that gather the videos together, which is very helpful instead of individually sorting. And of course, you can use the search function both on the website and YouTube to look for the topic of suspension, tires, ergonomics, all those kind of things, which will guide you to specific videos, because there's well over 1,000. So there's, I don't know, 25 years of work there in videos. As a school teacher by trade, what I try and do is take you through the process step by step in ways in which all of us can understand, versus very technical information, which alienates a lot of people because they just don't think that way. So I'll also pose a simple question like, would you leave your engine oil in 30,000 miles? Well, why is your fork oil and your shock oil in 30,000 miles then? Does that make any sense? Because you're accelerating your tire wear by 30%, and we spend too much money on tires as is. So I'll pose questions there as well, just to start a conversation. And the more conversations we have, and which is why I'm very grateful for this opportunity, the more people can start talking about things and making a difference for themselves. And in so doing, with the knowledge they gain, they can pay it forward and help others.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that, Dave. What I'll do then is I'll make sure that the link to your YouTube channel goes up on the program which is going into, and we'll be talking to you again on another show where we'll be looking at actual suspension setup, won't we?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time out to come and join us all on Elevenses, and we'll see you again soon next week. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Viewers, yeah, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Right, okay, well, there you are. That was the first part of our two-part interview with Dave Moss while he talked us through posture. There's lots of things to think about there. It's something that you will probably need to go away, chew over, and come back to at regular intervals. As I say, Dave's YouTube channel, I've given you a link to his website, and you'll be able to find the YouTube channel fairly easily from there. Go and have a look at what he talks about, where he breaks it down into small chunks. But the really important thing is that, as he says, that the motorcycle that comes off the factory floor is designed for one person and one person only, and that's the factory development rider. And it's absolutely vital that we do these little tweaks to the bike to make it fit us. I mean, one of the things that I would do all the time for trainees on basic training courses is adjust the clutch and the brake levers just to get the reach right for fingers, because we were working with everybody from sort of people who are under 5 foot tall to people who are well over 6 foot, with all the hand and finger size differences you'd expect. So we can all do little tweaks to our bikes, and it's astonishing how often somebody comes along to me and says, I have slow control issues. I find it really difficult to ride the bike around tight turns. And all I have to do to help them enormously is just adjust the clutch lever, get that right, and suddenly lots of riding issues become a lot easier. The same applies to the brake lever. If it's set too far away from your hand, you can't operate it properly. Obviously, there are other techniques as well, but those little tricks go a long way to sorting a bike out. Right, so anyway, let's wind up for now. I'll be back on Wednesday with the regular news, views, and tips show, and we'll finish Dave's two-part interview next Monday. A little bit of a longer one, and he'll be talking about suspension settings. So very much hope you've enjoyed the show today, and look forward to seeing you on Wednesday and again on Monday with Dave's part 2. So thanks very much, and bye for now.